So in this last segment of this week's lectures, we're going to talk about cybersecurity, which is one of the most critical topics that a medical software developer faces in this era of internet-connected devices. Everything is connected, so everything can be accessed remotely. So as we look at cybersecurity, let's just look at a couple of very recent examples. So here's an example from close to home. This is Yale New Haven Health System pauses radiotherapy treatment for 6 days after software breach. This is from the Yale Daily News, a local university newspaper. This is May 14 of 2021. And the SIS system is a vendor that uses cloud-based software to perform some analysis for this process. And they were hacked, and this meant that we had to stop radiation treatment for 200 patients for 6 days until they figured out what was going on. Radiation therapy has a way of finding its way into software problems. Here's another example, a non-medical example, even more recent, June 8, 2021, it's about a month ago. And this is from the disruption of the operation of the Colonial Pipeline. It's a major oil pipeline on the east coast of the United States. And a bad password was allowed hackers to disrupt the pipeline. This is what the CEO of the company told senators. This is a story from Reuters. So what is cybersecurity? The IMDRF has a guidance document on medical device cybersecurity, and here's their definition. It's a state where information and systems are protected from unauthorized activities, such as access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction to a degree that the related risks to confidentiality, integrity, and availability are maintained at an acceptable level throughout the life cycle. So this is the definition of cybersecurity. We are operating under control. Everything is fine. And the IMDRF in its guidelines, and this is all we're going to talk about it from these guidelines, gives a number of things that we have to keep in mind as we design software. So we have to secure communications. We have to have data protection, which often means encryption at a system level. We have to have device integrity, no unauthorized changes, for example, viruses or malware. We have to have user authentication, software maintenance, and we have to restrict physical access. So usually when you have access to physical computer, you can take the hard disk out, you can do all kinds of things. And we have to have reliability and availability. We have to allow devices to resist and survive changes. And the guidelines suggest that all of those factors need to be accounted for in the requirements of the device. This is not we design the device and then we worry about cybersecurity. No, cybersecurity needs to be factored in as we design a device. We'll have more to say about all of this in the context of the FDA regulations. So the FDA also has its guidance. It's a draft guidance, but don't let the word draft fool you. It still represents the thinking of the agency. And this is the content of pre-market submissions for management of cybersecurity in medical devices, which means, in plain English, this is what the FDA wants to see when you submit an application to allow your device to go to the market in terms of cybersecurity. So the FDA divides devices into two tiers. It's another form of risk classification like the ones we've seen before. Tier 1 is higher cybersecurity risk. That means that you have a device or piece of software can connect to another medical or non-medical product or to a network or the internet, and a cybersecurity incident affecting the device could directly result in patient harm to multiple patients. So if you fall into those two categories together, if those two things apply to you, your software is tier 1. Tier 2 is sort of standard cybersecurity risk. And the guidance gives an example of tier 1 devices. So implantable defibrillators, pacemakers, left ventricular assist devices, brain stimulators, and neurostimulators. You can imagine that anybody can access to those can cause significant harm to a patient. Now, when it comes to cybersecurity, the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that it's not just affects medical devices. If you have an elevator in a hospital that's accessed, controlled through the internet, and somebody can stop the functioning of that elevator, and there's a patient in that elevator on the way to surgery, being stuck in the elevator for an hour could cause significant harm to a patient. Now, the elevator is not a medical device, but a cybersecurity incident affecting the elevator is a significant problem. So the concept now extends beyond devices that affect diagnosis and treatment of patients and any support system that's required in a hospital to maintain that. Also, a hack in the appointment system of a hospital could have a significant impact on how medical care is provided to many, many people. So in section 5 of this guidance, they have a section called Designing a Trustworthy Device, and we're going to look at some of the guidelines here. Our device must be reasonably secure from cybersecurity intrusion and misuse. We'll talk about this in the next slide. It has to give you a reasonable level of availability, reliability, and correct operation. It must be suited to performing their intended functions, obviously, and it has to adhere to accepted security procedures. And all of that gets summarized as it has to be consistent with the NIST framework. The NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, this institute has a set of guidelines for cybersecurity, and we're going to look at the principles in this slide. This consists of 5 components. The first is identify. You need to understand your environment and what the risks are to systems, data, and people. We need to protect. We need to implement safeguards to limit the impact of a cybersecurity event. We need to detect. You have to have procedures to identify incidents, having continuous monitoring system in place. So we need to be able to figure out if we are under attack and if something has happened. We have to be able to respond and to contain the impact as quickly as possible. And we have to be able to recover. We have to have plans to restore any services that were affected by an incident. So when you make plans to deal with cybersecurity, you want to address all of those 5 points. You have to have mechanisms in place to identify the issues, to protect against attacks, to detect attacks, to respond to attacks, and then to recover the whole system as you go through it. So if we look at the guidance now, it has 2 sections that go through this thing. So when it comes to identify and protect, here are some of the suggestions. You want to limit access to trusted users and devices. You want to authenticate for safety critical commands. You want to authenticate all external connections. And then you have to ensure trusted content maintaining code, data, and execution integrity. So a lot of it is cryptographically variable updates. We verify integrity of incoming data, and you want cryptographic protection for all communications. And we need to maintain, and this links back to what we talked about in the last segment, confidentiality of data, and this comes down to we encrypt sensitive information at rest when it's on a hard disk and in transit when it's going over the network. So if you wanted to summarize this segment, if you want to summarize these guidelines, I would summarize them in 2 words: authenticate and encrypt. You want to authenticate your users, your connections, anything that comes from the outside. And authenticate isn't on one size fits all. You authenticate a user or device to have access to part of your content, all of your content, just the minimum amount of access that is required for that device or person to do what they need to do. And then encrypt. Obviously, system hardware encryption for everything. You don't want somebody to be able to come in, take the hard disk out, and then read all the information. You want to have encrypted communications everywhere. So if somebody's snooping in your network, they can't figure out what's going on. So those are the 2 key principles: authenticate and encrypt. This is the core of this process. The second half of the cycle will take us to detect, respond, and recover. But before we do that, we'll have a segment here from an interview from Dr. Rajesh Venkataraman from American Health Services. He'll talk us a little bit about their experience with cybersecurity.
So one of the big pushes from the FDA and even every regulatory body since the different incidents that have happened recently, and especially since COVID time, has been cybersecurity. There's a big section in the FDA that asks about, have you considered different cybersecurity features? Does your risk analysis, which is the crux of any regulatory body document, does it talk about what are the different cybersecurity risks that your software goes through? If there is patient data, if somebody comes and steals your device or steals the hard drive or steals the place where it stores the data, can they have access at it? So that's one of the questions they ask. So in terms of hardware, you need to have basic stuff like encryption. You need to let them know that, hey, not everybody can access the system. You need to provide them with a username and password. And the funny thing is, username and password, even though we have the security system, they are only as strong as your weakest password.
And that is, in fact, the biggest problem with cybersecurity. It depends on people as opposed to just software. And we'll talk about this next. So we also have to design our software to allow detection, response, and recovery. That's the second part. We need to be able to detect cybersecurity events in a timely fashion. We have to have forensic evidence capture, logging. We need to be able to respond and contain the impact quickly. We need to be able to notify users that we have a breach. We have to facilitate the rapid deployment of patches. And we have to have recovered capabilities or services that were impacted due to a cybersecurity incident. We have to protect critical data, and we have to have network attack resilience. So please realize that what this means is that you as a medical device manufacturer are responsible for monitoring your software after they go to market, and we'll talk about that at the end. We'll talk about deployment. And the deployment of patches means that the medical device manufacturer is going to provide those patches, which means that you have to have procedures in place to be notified for breaches, what the problem is, and to rapidly deploy patches to address issues like that. So you don't just sell a product and you forget about it. You have to stand behind it throughout its life cycle. The final comment here is going to come from the Singapore Health Service Administration, and this is just common on cybersecurity. Cybersecurity cannot be achieved by a single stakeholder. It requires a concerted effort of diverse stakeholders: government agencies, manufacturers, healthcare institutions, users of devices. We need continuous monitoring, assessing, mitigating, communicating cybersecurity risks and attacks, and all of that requires active participation by all stakeholders in the system. You can think of cybersecurity as a chain, You can see this chain below. And a chain always breaks at the weakest link, whether it's somebody who has their password called password, or a computer that's not been patched, or a network firewall that's open. All of those things, it's the weakest point that's going to give you entry into the system. So a friend talks about this as, we have to think like a thief here, not as an engineer. How can I get access to the system? And how do I prevent somebody else from getting access to the system? Complicating things, and this is the final slide of this segment, is we have to talk about data security in the cloud. So historically, data was stored in secure data centers protected by physical locks and firewalls in hospitals. Now, cloud storage is disrupting the system. We have things like Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, and all kinds of other providers. And the server may be located away from the hospital, in fact, often is, and even in another country, though regulations are beginning to stop that now. In some cases, the solution is to upload anonymized data, remember our previous discussion about safe harbor, to the server, have this analyzed, and re-identify this once the result comes back. Now, on the upside, cloud services can sometimes have higher security, especially when compared to homegrown systems. So now you're using a professional setup with professional-grade cybersecurity, and they may do better in providing security than what you could do on your own. So this concludes our discussion of cybersecurity. One could go on for an entire course on this. In many ways, cybersecurity in medical devices is not that different from cybersecurity in all kinds of other contexts. So you can look up information for other systems, be the finance sector or others, and you can learn useful lessons as well. But there are some things that are specific to the medical sector that we discuss and introduced here. In the next week's segments, we'll take a look at some of the management standards that underlie the creation of a medical software product, namely quality management systems and risk management. Thank you.